Welcome to my next mini lecture on Richard Powers' The Overstory. And for this mini lecture, I'm going to be looking at the first half of the section, Trunk, and entitling this mini lecture From Roots to Trunk, or From Capitalism to Socialism. And again, that second clause is a question. I want us to think about that as we're reflecting upon this section. How much is this novel moving from a capitalist landscape into a type of socialism? So the transition from part one to part two is a real transition. We're moving from roots to trunk, which on a grammatical level is a movement from a plural roots to the singular trunk. Moreover, the form of this novel changes from contained short stories, right, within roots. Each section was headlined by the name of a character, beginning with Nicholas Hole and moving on. So again, moving from roots, which had contained short stories, to embraided singular narrative, or maybe a singularizing narrative. You see all these narratives start to braid together. And as we move up, we see new form or new forms emerging. To make sense of this new literary form, I think we need to ponder, what is a trunk? Why does the trunk become the organizing principle or organizing aesthetic concept of this section? So a trunk is the main organ of a tree that supports the crown, the top of the tree. It functions as a conduit to carry water and nutrients between the roots and the crown. And again, to remember, right, the roots is the first section. You're moving up to the crown, which is the name of the penultimate section of the novel, which will end on seeds, which links, just conceptually, links back to Parable of the Sower with earth seed, which we'll talk about later. So again, the trunk functions as a conduit to carry water and nutrients between the roots and the crown, which is another way of saying it enables the necessary circulation of goods and services to all parts. And I wonder if we can begin to read the trunk as an allegory for community and an economy. Specifically, well, we'll think about it, maybe a type of economy that's moving towards socialism. How do we circulate necessary nutrients and water? What's necessary for life? How do we distribute that? What is the function or form? How do we distribute that to all parts, from the roots up to the crown? So formally, this book moves from what can be read as short stories, right? That when we read Nicholas Hole, um, Mimi Ma, Adam a Peach, they seem like collected short stories that have nothing in common. But we're going to move from the section of short stories to a singular story again, where all these narratives are going to intersect, which I think could broach a philosophical question. What does it mean to write stories through the prism of trunks rather than roots? What would it mean to start telling more stories not rooted in the first person, unique individualized narratives, but an expansive third person that extends to all matter and all parts of the non-human world? Because I think that's where Powers is asking us to go aesthetically. So in this sense, the first section of the book, Roots, which we see retrospectively, mirrors the alienation of capitalist life, these separate lives who seem to be struggling and suffering alone in isolation. And the energy of Trunk is that their stories are interconnected, and the revolution that many of these characters have to become activists, to become radical, is not just to care about the ecological world, but to learn to see themselves in a larger web of life, and not as alienated people stuck in their own trauma and tragedy. So aesthetically, again, this is a movement from roots to trunk, from the singular to the plural. And again, I want to suggest formally, if we're going to think more about genres, we're moving from a variety of capitalist forms to something looking like a socialist form, a more communal form. So in the trunk section, trees become a more explicit model for a new way of seeing, of being, and of becoming. And most explicitly, this is Patricia's project, who wants us to learn to see trees in a new way. And even the book she's writing, she wants to write for a wider public. Right? Patricia's book, in a way, mirrors Richard Powers' own project. And trees do not prove to be this radical figure of otherness. Rather, they become models for a more social, generous, alternative form of ethics, politics, and economics. Put differently, um, by studying trees and learning to see trees, we can reframe human society in more human, more humane, more caring, more generous, more socially and ecologically just ways. On page 218, we read, and this is from Patricia's book that she's authoring, quote, "Something marvelous is happening underground, something we're just learning how to see. Mats of mycorrhizal cabling link trees into gigantic smart communities spread across hundreds of acres. Together they form caste trading networks of good services and information." The way that Patricia describes trees is not just that they're a collectivity, but it's a network of exchanging goods and services and information. And again, she's writing and arguing that we can study the trees for a new form of economy, a gift economy, if you will, or maybe, again, as I've been suggesting, a socialist economy. But again, we have to learn how to see what's happening underground in this arboreal network. So one of the things I think we could ask is, why don't we see trees in this way? Another a part of Patricia's book, which is also on page 218, she writes, quote, "There are no individuals in forests, no separable events." The reason this needs to be said is because the dominant way we see trees, the way we have been enculturated to see trees, is to see them as isolated, as individuals, as individualized. And this is a very deep insight, because I think what it's suggesting is that our economy, our basic social structure to see everyone as individuals, into deprivilege and decenter community and social ways of being. We value individualism so much is that we project and map that individuality onto the natural world, that we even have this language to think about individual trees or isolated trees. We can't even see the different social formations around us, that there are no individuals in nature, there are no separable events or no separable stories. This argument, again, is a narrative argument and a narrative challenge. We need new type of stories that demystify and demolish this privileging of individualism and only seeing things as contained individuals and not within a network of sharing and gifting. On page 221, again, also from Patricia's book that she's authoring, quote, "Before it dies, a Douglas fir, half a millennium old, will send its storehouse of chemicals back down into its roots and out through fungal partners, donating its riches to the community pool in a last will and testament. We might well call these ancient benefactors giving trees." I think what we want to highlight, what Patricia's highlighting for us, is these trees have a communal identity. And by calling them giving trees, we see them as agents of gratitude, of giving, that riches are not something to be stored, but rather to be given freely. Such a beautiful image. And of course, it evokes the Shel Silverstein children's book, The Giving Tree, but completely reverses it, where the giving tree is a sad story about exploitation, right? The tree that keeps on giving to a boy who becomes a man, and this human just takes and takes and takes. The giving trees among themselves, they give to enrich the entire arboreal community, and in turn, the community is enriched by it. So again, this model of the giving trees is the very opposite of Shel Silverstein's giving tree, which is about humans being so self-centered they don't realize and recognize how they're continuing to exploit trees in the natural world. There are many radical ideas in the midst of Patricia's book, but perhaps the most radical is the need for us to think and see communally and ecologically, and not through the prism of individuals and private property. Um, and part of being able to see communally and ecologically is to start to see the natural world. And I want to flip back to just a brilliant periodization that Douglas makes, that we still live in the age of woods. Think about all the ways that we periodize the present, right? To think that we're living in a digital age, late capitalism, the age of the cell phone, the age of the computer, all the dominant ways of understanding and periodizing the present are so removed from nature in the ways we don't think about nature. And what all these characters recognize is how our everyday life is enabled by the ecological world. And what a difference it would be to think about that we're living in this age of woods. I want to briefly consider one character who has this revolution that we live in the age of wood, which is Olivia Vandergriff. Her story ends the first section, Roots, and when we begin with Trunk, we follow her story, and we see her transformation happen pretty rapidly. But I think this moment encapsulates a revolution. If we read along on page 165, quote, then she notices the cargo. She's stuck in front of a train, right? A large, long cargo train. Car after car clicks past, each loaded with pallets of dimensional lumber. A rolling river of wood cut into uniform beams streams by without end. She begins to count cars, but stops at 60. She has never seen so much wood. A map animates her head. Trains like this very minute, thread the country in every direction, feeding all the great metro sprawls and their satellites. Powers is such a poet. Reading his work out loud to me is like reading poetry. But you can just get lost analyzing the language here, from the use of alliteration, from sprawls and satellites, the internal rhyme of beams and streams. But thematically, what's happening is she's recognizing the materiality that enables capitalism, that these tons and tons of wood in multiple forms, stretching beyond almost what our imagination can conceptualize. And Olivia just begins to see, almost in a flash, the mass violence that enables our everyday capitalist lives to function and reproduce. Beginning in the second half of the book, we see all these characters, most of them, have a revolution. And revolutions, at least in this book, begin conceptually. They begin rooted in individual existential conditions or observations. Each of these characters move towards activism, tree activism, ecological activism. And as Powers narrates, that this is simultaneously a move away from capitalist ideologies and lifestyles. And again, that's something, if you wish, to chart how do these characters become activists? In what ways are they moving away from capitalist lifestyles of mass consumption, but also the ideologies of capitalism, such as this belief in private property, the belief in individualism? So one thing you may wish to consider and reflect upon is looking at one or two characters' journey away from believing in capitalist principles such as private property and moving towards an idea of a shared commons or a type of socialism. So you may wish to look at Ray Brinkman, and remember, he's an intellectual property lawyer. His job is to protect private property. Dorothy, his partner, and think about her anxiety over marriage because she understands it as a property contract. What does it mean to be the property of somebody else? Nicholas Hole, the fact that when Olivia meets up with him, he's giving away art. He's breaking from the profit logic and looking for something different. In Douglas's journey, which is a critique of private property and capitalism as well. And just a brief example of one of these characters, their revolution away from capitalism, when Douglas is arrested um, in that scene when he tries to protect the trees that are being torn down in the backyard of Mimi's corporate office. He's sentenced on page 204. We read, the court deliberates. The defendant obstructed a job being done by a private tree cutting company on city orders in the dead of night. As many of these characters see, this state is a neoliberal state that is outsourcing all public goods and commons in the name of privatization. You have a city that's hiring a private tree company to cut down trees in the dead of the night, hoping that this act of violence, of destruction, will remain invisible to the dominant culture, to most people. Douglas is seen as guilty. It's Douglas who's guilty for protecting or trying to protect these trees that have been there for centuries, as he said in a very powerful sentence, that these trees have been here before the white man came, and yet he's the one that's going to be a felon, that's going to be marked as a felon. And on page 205, he says, quote, humans don't know shit about nature or democracy. You might even think the crazies might be right. So much to think about and unpack there. One is, which is probably obvious, that the way human society is constructed, we're so removed from nature, we don't know anything about it. But that gets linked to democracy. Because we don't study nature and the models it gives us for living communally, that undermines our ability to both think and practice democracy. And here's where I want to end this brief mini lecture, which is not so brief anymore, is who gets recognized as crazy. Anyone that wants to challenge the norm becomes crazy. And I want to just meditate upon this very briefly. So who or what power structures or discourses determines which people are quote unquote crazy? Which leads to a second question, is every central character in this novel, every character featured in the Roots, are they deemed crazy by the normative world? Which also leads us to the flip side, the third question, what does it mean to be quote unquote normal? What does it mean to live a normative life? And is normal itself being narrated as a type of crazy by this book? So Olivia becomes a really important character, I think, for both charting and critiquing a normative, normal life. Again, she's the bridge character, that bridge that crosses over between Roots and Trunk. And on page 170, as she's broke from her quote-unquote normal life, she reflects, quote, the life her father begs her to return to, the drugs, the unprotected sex, the psycho parties and life-threatening dares, is hell itself, while this trip westward is bringing her back from the dead, end quote. As Olivia recognizes in her revolutionary journey, a normal life or a normative life is a form of living death, of social death. Her going out and breaking from the norm, as she says, this is what's giving her life. This is such a profound insight, at least to me, and I think this stretches across all the characters. Their journey towards this ecological commitment is not a movement away from life. In fact, it's a movement away from a type of social death, which we just see as normal. And in contrast, the radicalizing is spirit-giving. It elevates their spirit, and they see themselves as something more important than themselves and bigger than themselves. And how much have we internalized this logic of all the derogatory names that we call people who break from the norm, right? Calling them crazy. And again, all these characters, they use this language, or they're hippies, or tree lovers, or lost, right? They haven't found themselves, or they're wasting their lives, or they're unproductive from their time. We've internalized this ethics and this logic that we become both the police and enforcers of a normativity that actively disallows change from happening and actively forces people into myopic roles, myopic, singular, homogenous roles of what's quote unquote normal, which is gender normal, capitalist normal, racial normal, which is code for whiteness, right? But how important it is to break from norms, and yet how much we end up policing ourselves in the way we label people that act differently, that choose to follow or to walk along the unbeaten path. So I think this book is asking us to think and feel and to follow beyond labels. Can we learn to see these characters not as quote unquote crazy or tree huggers, but to really understand their logic, to empathize with them, and in the process, open up our own social, ecological, and political imagination? And I want to conclude with going in a slightly different direction, looking at Nilay Mehta, and this is like one more minute. And I apologize for the length of this mini lecture. Again, not so many anymore. He also has an encounter with the redwood, but I think Powers is offering us that it's not a normative experience. It's not like seeing trees necessarily changes us. Nilay becomes a game developer, and one of the games he develops, which becomes a global bestseller, is Mastery, which becomes this game or this digital space where tens of millions of people find their home. And just some questions to consider, those of you who do want to think about Nilay more. In what ways is this game, again, a game that tens of millions of people would rather spend time in than their real life, how does it replicate the experiment and process of capitalism and colonialism? Why is this a normative space to be in the activist work of other characters deemed crazy? In what ways does Nilay's narrative exemplify the logic of capitalist personhood? Note that he has to create a corporation, and as the text says, corporations are seen as legal personhoods. And finally, what is the status of nature in Nilay's passages in this section? Maybe one of the things to sort of suggest is why the digital space, in one sense, is a type of safe space, is in what way does the digital world allow us to transcend our material bodies? As Nilay says in several moments, while he's in this digital space, he's no longer seen as quote unquote disabled by the normative world. He's no longer seen as an Indian American or as Indian, as an other. A digital space allows us to live in this fiction of delinking from our material bodies. But how much is Power suggesting that we need to see and recognize the variety and diversity of our bodies and recognize the full intersectionality of all people and their lived, raced, gendered, classed lives? And by seeing that, we can build a more socially and ecologically just network and economy. But I'm curious, those of us who want to think more about the digital space in Nilay's character, if you wish to do that. Again, there's so much to think about. I hope some of the ideas in these mini lectures galvanize some thinking, or if you want to go in your own directions. Thank you again for listening. And again, I really look forward to reading everyone's reflections.